left we have...
Generally.
Oh, we are currently not having a proper connection. I'm going to stop that. We're going to have to start over again. Well, at least we're working on YouTube this week. Last week it wasn't working on Instagram, on YouTube. So let's discard this. Discard. And we'll start over. Okay. I love it. It's always so unpredictable what's going to work, what doesn't work.
Yes.
All right, let's try this again. Hello, good morning, everybody. This is me, Julian, and over here on my left, we have Jeneline, who is going to be hanging out with us for the duration of this live stream. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are joining for the very first time, welcome to our learning community. A year ago, or by now almost 2 years ago, I left academia, Jeneline left academia, we moved to the United States, and we started recording free open access introduction to philosophy classes that are available to everybody, anybody, anywhere, whoever would like to join, you can join us. We've been doing that for the past year. Today, we're going to be talking about ideology. We're going to be talking about philosophy, what ideology can tell us about philosophy, and vice versa, what philosophy can tell us about ideology. So if you're joining us for the very first time, you don't need to have any previous knowledge, no background in philosophy whatsoever. We're going to try to keep this accessible, relatable, hopefully somewhat entertaining, and most of all, instructional, educational. That is the goal, to make these classes open access for anybody. In fact, if you would like to make us very happy, please leave a comment letting us know what country you're joining us from. Do you remember some of the countries we had last year? Not last year, last week?
Yeah, we had students from Morocco, the Philippines, Mexico,
Algeria, tons and tons of people. So
Yes.
we always love it when you leave a comment telling us where you're joining us from.
Yes.
That's always highly appreciated. It makes us very, very happy.
Yeah, we're still joining from the U.S., but a different part of the U.S. We're on the road, as it were.
Yeah, we are currently in
Seattle.
That's right. We are spending 2 weeks in Seattle. Thank you guys for the comments, where you're coming from. And Hungary, we see. Indonesia is here.
Nice.
We have a global chat going on, so that's really quite wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to just start right here. This is going to be a 60-minute session. We're going to talk about ideology. We're going to talk about philosophy. There's going to be some references to... I'm not going to make it a whole class on Squid Game, but we're going to talk a little bit about Squid Game. And I think we should just launch right in. But before we start, I want to say this. Thank you. Thank you to our patrons. Our patrons are the ones who keep these classes free and open access for everybody, including you, those of you joining from India, Taiwan, Turkey, Florida, Philippines. It is really only because of the very generous support of our patrons that we can keep doing this for free and keep on doing it. So thank you guys so much. And as a little thank you, we usually like to post bonus content for every class for our patrons, exclusively for our patrons. They can download bonus audio for every class, transcripts for every class, tutorials for every class. That's our way of saying thank you to the patrons who keep the classes free for everybody else. Okay, with that being said, I think we should simply dive right in. Is that a good idea?
Yes, or tiptoe into the waters of ideology.
Yeah. But I actually, so in order to start talking about ideology, I want to talk a little bit about philosophy and what philosophy is, and maybe also what philosophy is not. So, I don't know, do you have this is just sort of opening it up here. Do you have an idea of what philosophy is to you?
I always think, literally love of wisdom. But for me, philosophy is how to grapple with ideas that often aren't addressed through other disciplines, whether it's ethics or how to live a good life or how to participate in civic society, things like that. Those are, for me, philosophical questions.
So it's really interesting that you say that, because technically, from my perspective, philosophy ends at the point where it's telling you what to do. And so any philosophy that tries to come up with a solution to a civic problem or a behavioral problem or an existential problem, to my mind, already transgresses into the level of sophism. And here's why. But you're very right to point out that it helps you think about the way in which you formulate those ideas. So here's what I think philosophy is. Philosophy is the reformulation of the problems we experience in society. However, that doesn't mean very much. So what does that mean? It means this. Sometimes the way in which we define a problem in our own societies contains a problem itself. Let me give you an example. We diagnose one of these social ills as being discrimination. And so we think to ourselves, well, what is a solution for discrimination? And then we say, well, what is the opposite of discrimination? I suppose tolerance. And so we make tolerance into the supposed solution for discrimination. And what the philosopher will do, and this is the key philosophical, approach, is to say, how in your diagnosis of the problem of discrimination, there is itself a problem. In other words, what is the presupposition you are making that you are ignoring? And of course, the presupposition that you are making in this case is that tolerance contains its own form of discrimination. There is the problem embedded into the solution in another form. That's a classic philosophical gesture. Ironically, usually those people who benefit from that form of tolerance or who benefit from the continuation of discrimination will then point towards the philosophers and say, oh, this is sophism. They're twisting the meaning of everything. Nothing means anything anymore. Even tolerance you've somehow corrupted, etc. And that's exactly not what the philosopher is doing. The philosopher will always point out how the way in which we diagnose a societal ill contains itself a disavowed problem. In this case, how tolerance contains within itself a form of discrimination. Let me give you an example of how this works, because obviously that's a loaded statement to make, that tolerance is discriminatory, because we think of tolerance as being the opposite of discrimination. So here's how it works. I actually grew up in Holland. Part of my teenage years were spent in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands have tolerance and civic tolerance as one of the principles of their society. It's sort of the ideal that is upheld. And here's what's so funny. In Holland, tolerance and the ideal of tolerance is precisely what the Dutch, the autochthonous population, use as a cudgel, in other words, as a form of discrimination against the non-Dutch population. In other words, if you're not Dutch, you don't truly know what tolerance means. In other words, since you don't truly know what tolerance means, for example, if you're a Muslim immigrant, we no longer have to tolerate you. And so the ideal and the principle of tolerance becomes itself the sign, the symbol by which discrimination continues. It's like the surplus of discrimination in its supposedly disavowed opposite content. We now discriminate against you by means of our tolerance. It is because of our tolerance that we no longer have to tolerate you. Does that make sense? And this is something that happens very, very often, and it's super fascinating. It doesn't even have to be political. For example, school uniforms. Usually, the idea of school uniforms starts as the posited solution to a societal problem. Oh, by the way, someone in the comments is from the Netherlands and has just affirmed that what I'm saying is accurate. So that is wonderful. I like this. Excellent. That's very nice that there's someone from Holland here. And okay, so usually, whenever we diagnose a social ill and we posit a solution, what I'm trying to argue is that that solution transposes the problem in another form. The same thing happens with school uniforms. Did you ever have to wear a school uniform?
Never.
No? So in the UK, it's very common to have school uniforms. And when I used to work as an educator there, children had school uniforms.
And I think I worked in Turkey when school uniforms were coming to an end. The era of school uniforms was at the end. I think I had some of the last classes where they had to wear them, yeah.
Nice. And so school uniforms are usually posited as we are bringing equality to the students. We don't want these students to experience any kind of discrimination based on the clothes that they wear. Whether it's because of some clothes being more expensive than others, whether it's we don't want to have hierarchies of appearance, etc. And of course, as soon as you introduce school uniforms, two things happen. One, A, the hierarchies are maintained. They're simply transposed onto other, more brutal means. For example, the hierarchy of appearance, the hierarchy of weight, the hierarchy of relative fitness or relative sleep deprivation. We have some people who are, in a sense, more quote-unquote beautiful or handsome than other children, which now can no longer be hidden through properly human expression, which is fashion. Not to say that fashion is hiding your ugliness. It's to say that part of our expression as an individual is to say beauty isn't just reducible to our appearance as such, right? So you've taken away that element. But of course, that element returns. Immediately, as soon as you start having school uniforms, children, students, even young adults, start tweaking their uniforms in minute ways to express individual preference. For the boys, it can be the way in which they have their tie. For the girls, it can be having a tiny bit of something untucked. It can be the way you button up, one or two buttons. There's many little ways in which we find differentiation within the system of the uniform itself. And there's something beautiful there because it means that the human will to expression, even on the level of differentiation, comes through. You can't suppress it properly. It's something that there's a surplus element of it because now your very expression isn't antithetical to the uniform, but it comes through in the uniform itself. And so if you want to bring Hegel into this, we've actually done sort of the opposite move of what Hegel always does. Remember, for Hegel, the problem always contains its own solution. This is something I've talked about a lot in the previous classes. However, it also works on the opposite level. In that sense, it's a chiasmic solution, which is that it's not just that the problem contains its own solution, it's that every solution contains its own problem. And that is the point of philosophy. The point of philosophy is to point out or to attempt to demonstrate how every solution contains its own problem. Now, of course, the utopia that any philosopher would imagine would be a utopia in which this process doesn't happen. Of course, we'll also see very quickly why this kind of a utopia is in fact a dystopia. In other words, a utopia in which there is no transferal of enjoyment. There's no surplus enjoyment. There's no surplus problem that emerges through the solution and vice versa, no solution that emerges through the problem. In other words, a hermeneutically sealed world is the philosopher's utopia. But it is a temptation that the philosopher has to resist. Because as soon as we create the idea of a hermeneutically sealed world in which we don't have the persistence of this principle, we have no longer reality, we have ideology. So let's take it a step back. I want to give you a very, very easy to understand example. You and me were watching a television series yesterday. It's actually one of my favorite shows. It cheers me up very much. This is the series Adventure Time. I've been going back and forth. You guys can decide this. If Jenny and I were Adventure Time, who would be Jake and who would be Finn? I want to know. This is a vote that we can have. So I was watching.
I'd be Coffee Princess. There must be a Coffee Princess.
Coffee Princess. Jenny would be Coffee Princess. I would be the philosophy wizard. The dialectical wizard. Okay, so we're watching Adventure Time. And as season 1 of Adventure Time was going back, and there's an episode where the idea of the episode, if you're not familiar with it, Adventure Time is a cartoon series from Cartoon Network that features two characters, Finn and Jake, supposedly a man and a dog, a boy and a dog. And they traverse this fantasy universe. It's a very sort of Dadaist show almost. It's very surrealist. Anyway, in this episode, the idea is that Finn, the boy, has taken an oath. And that oath is that he will make everybody happy if he can. He will do everything he can be to make people happy. And he'll move heaven and earth to make people happy. What he realizes very quickly, of course, is the ethical dilemma, which is that if you make somebody happy, it might be that the conditions for their happiness become the very conditions that create somebody else's unhappiness. For example, if somebody wants to hear loud music, you put on loud music, then you may actually be waking up somebody who is trying to fall asleep, right? Because they don't want loud music. And so this principle of I will make everybody happy very quickly reveals itself to be utterly impossible. Through his actions to make some people happy, he makes other people unhappy. And this presents a logical dilemma. And the show, being properly utopian fantasy show, actually says, no, it is possible to make everybody happy. And essentially what happens is that Finn, the boy, comes up with a machine, a contraption. What are those called? The ones, there's a name for them in the US. You know those machines where like a ball rolls down and like it starts a lever and then the lever moves the water and the water moves the wind and like we have this continuous motion.
For an artist, I can't remember.
Someone probably knows what it's called. And so Finn essentially builds a happiness machine, a Rua Goldberg machine.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you to the comments. Thank you, Benzer. A Rua Goldberg machine of happiness where everybody's moment of happiness triggers a sequence that makes somebody else happy. And so by the end of it, everybody is simultaneously happy and happiness has triumphed. However, this cannot continue. It cannot persist. And at the end of the episode, they have to come up with a little lie. They basically have to twist the experience, the reality for some of the key figures so that everybody's happiness can be maintained. And that's where the episode becomes ideological because the fantasy, the utopian ideal is, of course, a society in which everybody is happy all the time. In fact, the conditions of your happiness are making other people happy. This is like the communist undercurrent of that episode, which is that the conditions of your emancipation should be the condition of the emancipation of everybody else. However, where the show remains distinctly realist, capitalist, is that by the end of it, the only way to sustain that illusion is to have a lie, a central principle that upholds the idea that everybody's getting what they want, even if that's not necessarily true. That's the episode, pretty much, right? And so this is what's really interesting about this to me is that whenever we take a solution to a problem, a solution to a perceived social ill, whenever we take that and it fails, and then we still maintain that it is the solution, we've gone from one realm into the realm into ideology. In other words, ideology is the elevation of a solution into a principle. And you and I were watching Squid Game. And one of the things that I'm really enjoying about Squid Game is that as you get further into the series, this becomes increasingly overt. In fact, the master of the games insists that the sacred principle of Squid Game is equality and fairness. And that we can have brutal killings, we can have executions, we can have torture, we can have psychological deprivation, as long as the principle of equality and fairness is upheld. In other words, the games are honoring the principle of absolute and forced equality. And of course, in a weird way, we could imagine a Squid Game version of the Adventure Time episode where Finn becomes the game master and he says, in order to keep everybody happy, in order for happiness to be the principle of our society, I will create this machine that will guarantee everybody's unhappiness in equal measure and will say that they're happy in a way. And so ideology is exactly that point at which you take a failed proposed solution to a problem, usually a social ill, and then you forcefully uphold that illusion as being a principle. For example, equality and fairness. And in Squid Game, the principle of equality and fairness is specifically held up as being the opposite of the rat race of the capitalist contemporary society. And so Squid Game is actually upheld as a utopian alternative to the ruthlessness of contemporary capitalist society. And this is also where Squid Game isn't simply a critique of capitalism, but it's a critique of ideology. Because what sustains the dehumanizing, lifeless autocracy of Squid Game is precisely that it is reacting to capitalism in that sense.
You had a really nice point last week, I thought, about
Why, thank you.
about where the big other rests. And the parallel I thought that was really interesting was the relationship between the people and the market. And I think this is where, I mean, with a background in economics, I find this really interesting, is because we have let's say a societal issue like climate change, and we say, well, how do we resolve it? And the economist's answer is to say, well, we need more economics. If we create a carbon market where carbon pollution can be traded, if we commodify it, then we can reduce it and we can solve climate change. And of course, the exact opposite happens. Companies start figuring out how they can make their pollution even more profitable through speculation, by creating secondary markets, et cetera, et cetera. So this seems like a really perfect example of a situation where the solution does contain its own problem, precisely because the economic preoccupation with markets as the ultimate value, which must be upheld and maintained and protected and sanctified by whatever means necessary, shows sort of that ideological reification.
Yeah, it's a beautiful point, and you're exactly right to call it reification, which is the Marxist term of the Marxist way of referring to the Hegel's idea that every problem contains its own solution, every solution contains its own problem. You're exactly right, because what happens is when we look at the ecological disaster that is wrought by hyperinflated industrialization, global commerce, etc., we think, well, what is the solution to that? More of the same, but in a slightly different version. And that's, of course, all.
And it's infuriating. Yeah. It's just maddening. Yes, sorry.
No, exactly. And it is maddening. And of course, once you see through that, you realize it. You and I once went to a lecture by John Kerry, former Secretary of State. And one of the questions, and who is now the czar of climate change response.
Yep.
And he was asked on stage, what do you think, we should be doing about climate change? And he said, I don't think you should be doing anything. I think that we should encourage businesses to do more about it. A distinctly depressing moment, which is that we're going to look at the people who have gotten us into this mess, and we're going to ask them to solve it for us. Of course, anyway, here's the thing.
Let's get back on the rails here, sorry.
This is where we go from the difference between negation towards disavowal. Negation is simply on the level of saying, I'm going to propose something that this is not, the opposite of something. Disavowal is how you continue something precisely by means of not confronting its truly traumatic content. And so what happens today in, let's say, our society, it's not that we're all laboring under the illusion that our society can be sustained. It's not like we're all driving around thinking that our car is somehow magically not creating carbon emissions. It's precisely that we all know it, and yet we continue to do it anyway. And so it's not like we're somehow innocent of this process. This is the process of disavowal. And of course, one of the things that happens within capitalism is that the fetish persists. What I mean by that is that now when you buy something, you pay extra for it to be fair trade. You pay extra for it to be organic. You pay extra for a flight to plant trees somewhere to somehow stave off that knowledge. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you were having a beautiful day and the sun is shining and you're out having an ice cream and a cup of fair trade coffee, of course you don't feel like the world is going to end. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that happens, which is that we disavow the content of our own actions. It's not that we're doing them because we don't know better. We're doing them precisely because we know better. And that's where we're complicit, in a sense. Okay, so I want to talk for a moment about control and the difference between totalitarian control and authoritarian control and what it tells us about ideology. Mm-hmm. In a very simple way, very simplistic, authoritarian control is the principle of might makes right. I am forcing you to do X against your will because I have the power to enforce it, which is distinctly not how our society works. It's also not how capitalism works most of the time. Yes, you may not have a choice. However, there's never really an element of I am now forcing you to do this. I mean, it exists, but it's relatively rare. Totalitarian power, on the other hand, is to say, I am not forcing you to do X. You are doing X on your own volition. And so where's the empty place of power in the two instances? It's in a different location. In an authoritarian society, the empty place of power resides in a higher authority. I am forcing you to do this on behalf of the king, or on behalf of the god, on behalf of the state. In a totalitarian society, this gap, this empty place of power, has been transposed into you. I am doing this on behalf of you. I am doing this in your own interest. I am doing this because I am the representative of the will of the people. And so you've transposed the empty place of power back into the subject, into the individual himself, or itself, or they self, or whatever. And what's really important to note here is that this process is so powerful, both in a, let's say, negative sense and in a positive sense, because that empty place of power, that totalitarian kernel, exists precisely in democracy as well. We talked about this last week, how in a democratic society, you are momentarily abstaining from your own individual agency on behalf of the democratic vote, the expression of the will of the people. Of course, we can never have a direct representative of the will of the people. It has to then be mediated through elected representation. And so there's that gap, which is the gap of the empty place of power that is transposed into the idea of the people, but crucially, that is then transposed back into the system of governance itself. This is what does not happen in a totalitarian society. In a totalitarian society, the empty place of power is simply transposed into the people, and that's it. And so you say everything I do is now for the people. It's only in a liberal democracy that that empty point is then refracted back into politics itself. In other words, we're not telling the leaders what to do. We're saying the leaders on our behalf can make a decision that will reflect precisely the impossibility of deciding what the people want. And so any society that starts claiming that a politics is a direct manifestation of the popular will is precisely an ideological society, because it is trying to paper over the necessity of transposing that gap, the empty place of power, into the power structure. That's a little bit technical, but I'm going to try to give some examples. You were going to say
Yeah,
something?
no, I think that's really helpful, but I think sometimes what can be challenging when we're talking about ideology is, I think that in parallel to the hermeneutic temptation is there's this temptation to say, oh, if only we could reveal the ideology, if only we could see the inner workings of the system, then we could unmask the system, see it as it is, and then it would just vanish. It would just vaporize because it's been revealed. And that's not how it works. I think that's a misleading view.
It's so funny that you're saying that, because that's quite literally where I was going next. So I'm really glad that I like it when you and I are vibing, like when we really know exactly what's coming. You are so correct. I'm going to try to lay it out as simply as I can. There's a little bit of confusion in our society as to what constitutes ideology. In fact, most people seem to think that ideology is simply political ideology. In other words, that ideology is to have an agenda, that you are somehow masking your true intentions because you have a preconceived, let's say, political belief, ideology. And to this extent, the popular common sense definition of ideology is as something bad, which is prejudicing you and preventing you from having objective interpretations of reality, right? In this sense, ideology is always presented to you as being something that is corrupting you. That political ideology is what is preventing our society from being harmonious. This is also the classic narrative of the post-ideological move, the end of history in a Fukuyama sense, right-wing Hegelians, the idea that, the fall of the Berlin Wall heralded the end of the age of ideology and the beginning of the age of global capital, and so on and so on. Of course, we will immediately have to make the philosophical move, which we announced at the beginning of this class, which is to say that in the positing of the solution to ideology, which is the supposed end of ideology and the free exchange of ideas and people, we see precisely an ideological move par excellence. However, it's not even that. It gets even worse. Because as soon as somebody promises you that you are waking up from ideology, that you are seeing through ideology, as you put it, that is precisely when you are in ideology to the most extreme. And I'm going to explain to you why. Here's an example that everybody can understand. There's an advertisement. No, let me put it like this. I've been watching a lot of daytime television recently. I've reached the stage of my life where I will find myself in the middle of the day watching, I don't know, something on TV. And here in the United States, there are many, many ads, especially for daytime television.
Especially if you're a baseball fan and the playoffs have been very exciting and extra innings, which means that there's extra advertising opportunity.
Been a lot of baseball. That's right. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, a lot of baseball. And there's a lot of ads for the military. There's a lot of recruitment advertisements. And I've probably mentioned this in one of the classes before, but there's one advertisement in particular that I really love. I find it super interesting. I should specify here that when I say interesting, I find it sort of insidious and problematic and etc. But it is interesting precisely for those reasons. And I'll give you a very brief description of how this advertisement works. We see a man walking through a 21st century nighttime scene. It's sort of like Blade Runner, lots of bright neon lights, holograms, etc. And the voiceover says, "Are you searching for meaning in a ruthless world? A world in which everybody's trying to sell you something, a world of, narcissism and status and constant online communication. However, the more you feel connected to people, the more detached you feel." The ad doesn't use the word alienation, but essentially the more alienated you feel. And then we see a soldier diving off a diving board into the water. And as soon as he hits the water, the illusion is transpelled. In fact, we literally see there's like a hologram and a soldier, and the hologram's trying to sell the soldier himself. So the hologram looks like the soldier trying to sell him sneakers, and the soldier like punches through the hologram, and it says, "Trapped in a world of illusion." Exactly, yeah, someone literally put it in the comments, "Trapped by an illusion." And so at this point, the soldier wakes up. He has seen through the ideology of consumer capitalism, and he has joined the military.
To be a soldier for capitalism.
And the slogan of the ad is "The battle to belong." And it's very interesting. I'm not just making fun here. There's many things that are happening here that are distinctly of interest. One, we can immediately make the somewhat cynical leftist critique, which is that the military is, of course, precisely what upholds the very society it is telling you to see through. Yes, we live in a society of global rampant consumer culture. However, the military is designed to imperialistically enforce that particular lifestyle. And so what is presented to you as an escape from that lifestyle is actually joining the ranks of an institution designed to safeguard that lifestyle. So that is the most basic, cynical take that we can have on this. But secondly, what's so fascinating is that the military here is not presenting itself as join the military to serve your country, join the military to be part of something bigger than you. Instead, it's saying, in a very Western individualistic sense, join the military to find the true you. Find your truest individual expression through belonging to the military. Be part of something. And it's sad also because, yes, alienation and disaffection and a sense of loss of self and loss of agency and this sense of living in a depraved society in which you only exist to the extent to which you are a consumer is something that affects everybody in society. And what makes it sad is that then the military would prey on the people who see through that and then say, here is the thing that will help you wake up from it. And so we're basically saying here, as someone said in the comments, join for a purpose, right? And so what's really, really interesting to me about this whole advertisement here is that not only A, is it saying join the very thing that upholds the thing you think you're resisting, not only B, is it saying have a purpose in a world bereft of purpose, but finally C, it presupposes something very dangerous, which is that the military is not ideological, that the antidote to an ideological world of illusion, as they call it, right, trapped in an illusion, is the non-illusion, right, the full waking objective reality of military participation. And that's the problem in the ad. That's what makes the ad dangerous and downright fascist. Why fascist? Here I'm being very specific, not fascist as in, oh, Trump is fascist, etc., because I don't believe he is. Fascist in that what immediately happens here is the question, well, if the military is real objective reality, and if society is illusion, who has created that illusion? And of course, the classic fascist gesture would be to say it's commerce from the Jews, anti-Semitism, global conspiratorial elites. And if we only went back to brotherhood and honor and manliness and the true virtues of what it means to be objectively in the world, we can live a meaningful life. That's the fascist core in that ad. It wouldn't be fascist if it said, join the military to serve your country, join the military to, protect your family. It would be ideological, but it wouldn't be fascist. Where it becomes fascist is that it posits in a very reactionary sense that the world that is the objective world of social relations and market forces and capitalism and consumer society is somehow a conspiracy against the objective reality of true belonging, true manliness, true participation. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's the dangerous part of this ad. And so I want to go back to the idea that the presupposition that the advertisement makes, which is the presupposition of all ideology, is the presupposition that there is precisely a non-ideological place. This is very important, so I want to repeat it. If you present ideology as something that we should move away from, as something you can step outside of, you are presupposing that there is a space that is not touched by ideology. A sort of pure, let's say, unmediated reality in which we have no ideology. And that is, and I've said this before, that is precisely ideological. That's what's so devious about the ideological move of moving away from ideology. Now, this is where we can go back to the problem of philosophy, and we can make this a little bit more technical, because we're really talking about something that Hegel was already very interested in, which is the idea of subjectivity. Subjectivity is what Lacan calls ego, in a sense. And the word subject already contains this very problem. The problem of how can you be truly experiencing freedom if your freedom comes at the cost of a certain type of unfreedom. To put it very plainly, to be a subject, and this is even in the word, I think this is where I can ask you to come in with like the non-philosophical common sense. The word subject has two meanings. Why is it a confusing word, subject?
Because like grammatically, it's the notion of like the active participant.
Yeah.
But subject as a word also means the recipient of action.
It's perfect. Yeah, I love that I can rely on you for this. Exactly. Yes. So to be a
exposition master.
The subject of a sentence is precisely the active part, the protagonist,
yes.
The subject, the main character, as it were. However, to be subject is also precisely to be subjected to someone, to a higher authority, to be object, as it were, if you see what I mean, right? And this is also the classic, like, biblical, be subject to one another. Be subject to one another is to posit an impossibility, but it is precisely the impossibility that explains the ontology of the Christian faith. Okay, let's take a step back and explain why that is. To be subject to another means that you are both the main character. In other words, you are the agent of your own authentic free expression. However, you only become that agent to the extent that you subject or submit yourselves to others. And this is something that is denied within most liberal free societies, is that the only way that you experience your subjective civic freedom is precisely because there's a whole realm of civic unfreedoms that you accept. This is also something that I think gets especially lost in the United States. In the United States, we take the idea of freedom, right? The idea of freedom, and we raise it to a principle, the principle of freedom. However, freedom only ever emerges as the condition or as the result of certain unfreedoms, whether it's unfreedoms before the law, which precisely are presented as equality. Whether it's that you can't simply go out and do whatever you want. There's all these ways in which we are unfree in society, which is precisely how we guarantee civic freedom. And so when we elevate freedom, not into that, but into a principle, we're already in the realm of ideology. Okay, to go back to subject, into subjectivity. If your own experience of subjectivity, of agency, only emerges on the condition of being subject to some higher authority, there's a couple of things that are happening here. One, for Hegel, this is precisely the role of the king. The king is the embodiment of the empty place of power itself. And it is under the king that civic participation can occur. And what Lacan corrects Hegel with is to say that this principle of the symbolization of the empty place of power isn't just true for the king, but it's true for everything. It's what he calls the big other. We need to have an empty place of power that creates an umbrella, as it were, under which we have the expression of authentic subjectivity. This is also why for Lacan, it's so important to point out that the subject is a subject only to the extent that his freedom comes as the experience of a certain amount of unfreedom. In other words, to be very Lacanian, that the split between freedom and unfreedom is already embedded within the subject to begin with. That we cannot conceive subjectivity simply as something you start with and a fall away from subjectivity, but that subjectivity emerges in the fall itself. In other words, that in the perceived fall of the subject from the idea of pure freedom, we have subjectivity, which is, of course, also anti-ideological to that extent, because the ideological move would be to say that we have a pure subject to begin with, from which freedom is taken. Then we're back at the level of the ad for the military. You are either trapped by illusion or not trapped by illusion. For Lacan, subjectivity only comes into play precisely because you are always already trapped in illusion. And so subjectivity isn't the antithesis to illusion. It's not the antithesis to being trapped. It is precisely the experience of authentic agency that emerges from within the condition of being trapped. And so why is this? To go back to what I was saying, because there is a point here. Why am I saying that this is also the Christian logic within Hegel, the be subject to one another? And why is it part of the ontology of the fall creating the thing it is falling from? Here we can point towards Zizek, because this is actually the most concise definition of Zizek's ontological move, which is to say that you are never falling from something or moving from something, but that the thing you are moving away from emerges in the moving itself. My own reading of this, which you can find in previous classes, is precisely the chiasmic structure. The chiasmic structure isn't to say we go from A to B to A. It's to say that X, the moment between B, emerges retroactively as the fall itself. Anyway, I'm not going to explain that here because it's too complicated, and I don't want to be cruel to people who have just joined. But there's a couple of examples here. Christ on the cross. And this is also why I just yell Christ on the cross, but Christ on the cross, in the lens of Hegel, will explain to you perfectly why Hegel is the philosopher of love. And here's how it works. What Hegel points out so precisely is that the crucifixion is the end of a certain type of religion. It is the end of the type of religion where authority rests in a higher form. The authoritarian system by which we are mortally impotent, finite beings, and we are trying to reach the heavens to where God and infinite wisdom and love resides. This is, in a sense, the pagan universe. A pagan universe that we still see very much in contemporary approaches to spirituality. It's the idea that there is a higher form of being that can be reached if we tap into it somehow. What Hegel points out is that the moment of the crucifixion is the moment where Christianity is no longer a pagan religion in this precise sense. Why? It's because you've taken the gap between God and the people, and you've transposed that gap back into God himself. And vice versa, in the same move, you've transposed that gap back into the people. In other words, the scene of the crucifixion, which appears to us as negation, or in a sense, pure reflection, is in effect what Marx would later call determinate reflection. It is precisely the moment at which the problem contains its own solution. This also means that we go away from the perceived split of God and the fall from God towards the idea that the fall from God is precisely what creates God itself. And this is why Hegel is the philosopher of love, because when Christ talks about the second coming, when we hear about the second coming, it's precisely not Christ comes back to earth. It's precisely not that Christ failed, so he went back to God, and then God says, okay, people have forgotten how much they hate you, so now we're going to send you back to earth. Don't get crucified this time. That's distinctly not what happens. We no longer need the figure of Christ because the second coming has already happened. The second coming, as Christ puts it, is to say, whenever there is love between you, you will find me. In other words, in the affection and the affinity and the experience of the non-quantifiable substance of love, the substance that has to be continuously renewed, the ultimate renewable energy, love, we have the persistence of Christ beyond the supposed solution to the problem of Christianity. In other words, that the death of Christ is precisely the condition for the emergence of Christianity in a non-pagan form, in the form of the Holy Spirit. And of course, Hegel already knows this because Hegel says that this is how all of history works. Hegel says that the death of Caesar, for example, wasn't what prevented the Augustinian rule, it's what created the Augustinian rule. In other words, when Caesar was assassinated, it was because of the following problem. The senators looked at Caesar and said, we think that Caesar is the end of the Republic. This man is a dictator, and he will spell the end of the Republic. What the senators didn't realize is that the Republic had already ended by means of Caesar. And so killing Caesar wasn't the gesture by which they saved the Republic. It was the gesture by which they formalized the beginning of Augustinian rule. And so the big what-if scenario is, would Augustinian rule have occurred without the assassination of Caesar? And we may well speculate that it would not have. Hegel says we can't even speculate because this is where history is determinate. History isn't just moving from A to B. History is always impacting upon itself, refracting upon itself. What is posited as the solution to the supposed end of the Republic is precisely what emerges as the beginning of the opposite of the Republic. And so that's what Hegel then transposes towards Christianity to court. He says that what appears as the moment of ultimate failure in Christianity, the crucifixion of Christ, the emissary of God, is precisely the beginning of the Holy Spirit, of the community of the faithful. It's precisely transposing the gap between God and the people back into the people itself. And that's a chiasmic move, because now the thrust of the faith, the thrust of the movement isn't to go, it starts with God and it trickles down to the people. It's localized in that moment of failure, that moment of determinate reflection, and it goes both ways outside. It becomes a chiasmic structure. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so why are we still talking about Christianity here? Aren't we living in a secular society? Isn't religion precisely the, embodiment of ideology today? The reason we're talking about this is the following. If subjectivity emerges in the exact same way, then something very interesting is occurring. If subjectivity is not that you go from the realm of pure objective reality towards the world of illusion, and as the military ad promises you, you go from the world of illusion back into pure objective reality, well, then where does reality come from? And the answer that every Hegelian Lacanian philosopher will tell you is that reality wasn't there to begin with. Reality is what emerges precisely through the failure to inhabit reality. In other words, that reality is experienced precisely as the breakdown of reality, as the perceived illusion of reality, that we cannot as human beings engage directly with reality, not because we're barred from reality, but because reality exists only in the barring from reality itself. In other words, in the same way that you have the idea that we no longer have a gap between God and the people, the gap is transposed back into the people, any properly philosophical move will tell you that we don't have a gap between objective reality and subjective reality, but that objective reality emerges when you transpose it back into the subjective experience. And this is also why, from an ideological perspective, anybody who promises you that you can wake up and see through ideology and go back towards objective reality is precisely having to stitch that. They're having to stitch it through the upholding of a certain principle, which is the presupposition of objective reality as an a priori itself. And that is an ideological move because that has to be enforced. And that's exactly how ideology works. And so the best way to quote unquote see through ideology is to see ideology not as the antithesis to objective reality, but to see how objective reality is itself shaped within subjective experience, which is exactly how you end up at what becomes so crucial for the structuralists, the post-structuralists, the postmodernists. It's not to say that everything is a quote-unquote social construct. It's precisely to say that objective reality is the construct. And that if you want to move away from such a construct, you have to go to the idea of a pre-mediated reality conditioned by subjective experience, which is a profoundly liberating move because think about it, at the end of the day, if there is an objective reality out there to which we have to submit ourselves, then what is human agency even for? What is it about? And so that is why ideology, when it is presented to you as a social ill that has to be combated with some solution, usually empirical objective reality, is transposing the problem of ideology back into the solution. In other words, the proposed solution to ideology is itself ideological. Thank you very much. That's it. That was a bit hard at the end, wasn't it?
No, I'm with you.
I know I was yelling a little bit at the end, but I think it's a really important thing to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really, I think you're right to talk about ideology in context with political ideology, because I think that's how a lot of us have thought about vaccine hesitancy or behavior during the pandemic, is to say, well, it's ideological or it's political, and if only people could be more rational or more, believe in science, etc. But I think that you're right in pointing out ways in which that is disingenuous. It's trying to take a shortcut.
The question is always, what do we do next? Because if you say that the most ideological thing to do is to present a non-ideological take, then the question is, well, what do you do if you can't step out of ideology? What if ideology is simply the refraction of all subjective social experience? Like, what do you do then? It seems like a cop-out in a weird way. And what's so important to express here is that it's precisely objective reality that is upheld as a principle to suppress subjective experience, that is designed to suppress your agency in the world. And so the funny thing is that it's precisely because of the incompleteness of ideology. It's precisely because ideology, okay, let me put it like this. Ideology is nothing less and nothing more than the suggestion of completeness where there is only incompleteness. If something is happening to you and you succumb to the hermeneutic temptation to read meaning into something, why this is happening, you are already within the realm of ideology. We are bound to it. And so the most counter-ideological move, if you want, the only way to be truly anti-ideological without succumbing to that fantasy is to point out the manner in which substance, right, objective reality, is always pre-mediated through subjectivity, which is Hegel's idea of substance equals subject. All of this is highly technical, so we're going to talk more about it in the Discord. But thank you guys so much for joining me today. We are inching closer towards the conclusion of this lecture series. Next week, I'm going to conclude this series. It's going to be, I know that seems early, but we're going to conclude it next week so that we can have a wrap-up episode afterwards. This is the series on the hermeneutic temptation. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I just want to say very briefly that if you'd like to download these classes as an audio file, if you'd like to either join the live audio discussion or download the live audio discussion afterwards, because we host a live discussion for another hour after every class on Discord, you can do that on our Patreon. It starts at $5 a month. It's what keeps these classes free for everybody. If you'd like to download the summary tutorial that I record every week, it's called a masterclass, where I summarize the class in 5 minutes. If you'd like to download the transcripts, the edited transcripts, so that you can read these classes in written form, you can find that on Patreon as well. So please do take a look at the Patreon where we record a bonus audio. I suppose you could call it a podcast on Patreon. If you would like to join the Discord, simply sign up to the first tier on our Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Jenneline and Julian, or click the link in our bio or in our About page. We're going to be taking a 5-minute break, and then we're going to record the bonus audio, which we will also post to our Discord as an audio file, as to our Patreon. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to keep talking on Discord. Thank you guys so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Jenneline, for hanging out and being a part of this class. I super appreciate it. Thank you guys for vibing with us. And we will see you next week, or we'll see you in 5 minutes on the Discord. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.